Hello everyone, welcome to another Animation Friday, and today I am going to be looking into my personal favorite Futurama episodes. Now, I may be limited as far as the amount of episodes that I have seen, and I'm sure that you could argue whether or not certain episodes are superior, but these ones are the ones that I sort of more personally enjoy. And I apologize that this video had to be delayed. Unfortunately, I was pretty busy over the weekend, but I should be caught up by the end of Sunday of today. So without further ado, the first episode that I wanted to briefly discuss is Jurassic Bark. This one is, I think, from my understanding, a much older episode. But basically, it follows Fry discovering the remains of his pet dog. And just to give you a sort of a background into Futurama, basically Fry is the main character of the story. He ends up going to the future through some really kind of wacky circumstances. And as a result of this, he sort of ends up being stuck there. And it's basically, he goes from being in the year 2000 to being in the year 3000. So once he finds these dogs' remains, he has this idea to ultimately clone the dog. So basically kind of bring the dog sort of back to life, but in a form of a clone. But he ultimately ends up deciding not to do this, and you'll sort of see the reasoning behind it. And this ends up leading into something that's sort of ironically tragic. And it ends up being a lot more of a serious episode than usually Futurama's episodes end up being, because basically Futurama is primarily designed to be a very adult, comedic-oriented animated television show. But here it kind of goes for that angle of trying to be a little bit more emotionally, I guess, involved, in the sense of being a little bit on the side of dramatic. And for what it is, considering that it is a Futurama's episode, it still offers the humor and all of that, but it also, again, stands out because of the fact that it focuses on something that was primarily involved within Fry's life before he ended up getting into the year 3000. So I think that's something that's also a bit in which it stands out from a lot of the other episodes that I've seen. And at the end of the day, I think it ultimately works as far as the show is concerned. So I would definitely recommend that one. Moving on to the next one, which is, in this case, Godfellas. And the interesting thing about this episode is that it focuses on something entirely different here. As opposed to the first episode that I mentioned, which primarily focuses on Fry and kind of his past within the year 2000, we get a scenario in which it focuses on solely another character, in particular another main character, Bender, who is a robot. And basically Bender ends up drifting through space after a battle involving space pirates. And yes, it sounds as goofy as it does sound, and you'll sort of see what circumstances lead into that. And then eventually, as Bender sort of drifts through space as a result of having a battle with space pirates, an asteroid crash lands on Bender. And basically, the asteroid has these cute little miniature life forms that end up sort of developing a colony, and in doing so end up worshipping Bender as sort of their god. And you'll see how this ultimately tragically goes in a bad direction. And then you'll see how Bender eventually encounters a sort of godlike entity, and he has sort of kind of like a philosophical, somewhat uh, uh, kind of interesting conversation with it. And then eventually he ends up going back to Earth. But what I think works really well with this episode is the fact that, again, it focuses on something that's sort of not really touched upon in a lot of Futurama episodes. And it really does address the whole idea of religion, of the concept of God, of the idea of people, looking to a higher source to kind of protect them and be their sort of, I guess, savior, you could say. And it really brings up all of these interesting ideas. And it does so with humor as well. So it's also fairly fairly funny, while also having a sort of its serious and introspective, I guess you could say, moments. So I think that's ultimately why this particular short works, sort of in a similar way to how Jurassic Bark works. It combines the humor with a lot of serious elements that people with an everyday life, I think, can identify with. So that's also something that's rather interesting, and I think ultimately works to this particular episode's advantage. The third episode that I wanted to briefly talk about is A Flight to Remember. This one I remember primarily because it offers a lot of interesting things that I think are sort of unique to a Futurama episode. Instead of focusing on certain characters or trying to have it focus on everybody, all of the main characters in a certain way, this episode does something on top of that and does it in the form of, I guess you could say, a satire. Because basically what this episode satirizes is Titanic, in particular the movie, as well as kind of the whole disaster itself. And what you get out of this is a variety of different subplots, each of them funny and goofy in their own unique and special way. And the overall humor, I think, really is something that also really sells this particular episode really well. And everybody's sort of place, at least within the episode, I think really also works really well. Like, for example, Zap Brannigan is the captain of the ship, which you will see how this sort of ends up leading to disaster. And it works out great. It does, and again, it's like a Titanic ship, but in space. So again, it plays up that sort of satire in a very, over-exaggerated way. And it's what I think ultimately makes it work and what makes it, for me personally, stick out. Now, the second to last episode I'm going to be mentioning is actually, I think, the first episode of Futurama, which is Space Pilot 3000. And basically, it involves, obviously, the main character, again, Fry, who ends up being sent to the year 3000. Now, I think what actually makes this episode stand out to me personally is the fact that it really does a good job of introducing everything to us. It introduces the kind of humor it's going to have. It introduces us to the kind of world it's trying to create. It's introducing to us all of the characters and what particular role they serve. Again, majority of the characters. There's still some characters they don't introduce right away, but the majority of the main characters are really introduced right away. And we understand what really is kind of the underlying premise is involved. And I think that's also something that really ties in well with the way in which they execute the humor right out of the gate with the episode. At least with this first episode, is that they show you what kinds of scenarios that Fry runs into, being somebody that is clearly not from the time period. And you ultimately end up seeing how he sort of ends up fitting in within this world that he doesn't really ultimately belong in. And it's one that I think actually does really work, and I think a lot of people in particular remember the first episode as being one that a lot of people, I think, remember, because it really does stick out as far as trying to really set the stage for the television show. And last but certainly not least, this one is probably one of the more, I would say, out of a lot of the episodes that I've seen, this one has the kind of humor in particular that I enjoy a lot from Futurama. And that particular episode is Love's Labor's Lost in Space. And basically, this is also sort of an introductory episode because we get introduced to Captain Zap Brannigan, and we also get introduced to his assistant Kif, and you sort of ultimately end up seeing what these two sort of serve as far as a role within the show. And the way they get involved is ultimately Lilo, who is the captain of the Planet Express ship that Fry sort of, again, he ends up sort of really working for her, along with another character who is basically just titled Professor Farnsworth. So basically, she and Fry get in contact with these two characters, Zap Brannigan and Kif, while they're sort of on a mission, and Leela ultimately wants to save some animals that are sort of doomed on this particular planet, and you sort of see how Zap as well as Kif kind of get sort of in the way of this and how they really get involved. And what ends up happening, I think, leads to a lot of hilarity. And the way in which they kind of showcase this character of Zap Brannigan in particular is one that is just so unbelievably hilarious to watch. He's probably one of the most funny characters of the show, although there obviously are other funny ones too. But the way they just, I think, ultimately kind of show what kind of a person he is, it just makes it all the more funnier and entertaining to watch. So I think that's why, in particular, I think this episode stood out to me as far as really getting the ball rolling for his part, at least within the show. But I think that's really all I can say about all of these episodes. I'd be more than happy to hear what favorite episodes you have, if you watch Futurama or know any episodes that you in particular enjoyed or thought were really interesting and or funny. Feel free to let me know, but I think that's really ultimately all I can say for this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a pleasant day, week, month, and year, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Take care. Bye-bye.